Today's top story. Maybe your child isn't just lazy and distracted. He may have a learning disability. Really?
This would drive him crazy because I'd be missing words, missing paragraphs, missing sentences, and he couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand it because I thought I knew where my eyes were going, but it's one of those cases, what you don't know, you don't know.
The Learning Disabilities Association of Canada estimate that 10% of Canadians, that's 3 million people, suffer from a learning disorder. Often they get labeled by parents and teachers as distracted or dumb. Well, not so. On Top Story today, we'll hear from Irving Hexham, who struggled for years before getting to the root of his learning disability. Stay tuned. In a moment, we'll meet him. Hi, welcome to Top Story. I'm Sheila Rowe. Well, when Irving Hexham was a boy, school was no fun. Where other kids might breeze through a math problem like 3 plus 3 plus 3 equals 9, Jeremy wouldn't see it that way. He'd see 33 plus 3 equals 36. It was exasperating for him and for everyone else. In the same way he missed symbols in math, he'd miss letters in words. Here was this kid who seemed smart. Maybe he just wasn't paying attention. Well, it took years before Jeremy got to the bottom of his problem. He's my guest on Top Story today. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you for having me.
I have to say that the first time I met you was probably about 20 years ago.
Yep.
You were a little guy at the time, and I have to say you always struck me as being a pretty smart little guy.
Well, that was the joys of listening to CBC and coping with my learning disabilities, is I could take in verbal information, not necessarily visual through reading materials.
Mm-hmm. But the fact is that you were a smart kid. You always were a smart kid, but you just had problems with certain aspects of learning.
Yes, exactly, with the school aspect of learning. The written, the textbooks, looking, reading, math, copying information down from the board, putting it back onto my notes, so things would never make sense.
That example that I just gave of 3 plus 3 plus 3 equals 9, but for you, it would be 33 plus 3. Was that a common kind of problem that you'd have where you just missed something?
Yeah, and it wasn't so much the 3 plus 3 plus 3. That I could handle. It was when it was something like 34 plus 32 plus 96 or whatever, when you had the two columns plus, that's where the real problems came in with the math. But with the reading, it was a continuous problem. Unless I had my finger right under the words, I couldn't really read what was going on.
So give me an example of what you would see and what reality was.
Well, I would miss words, I'd miss sentences, I'd miss paragraphs, I'd be reading books, and I mean out loud, especially I'd read with my dad, and this would drive him crazy because I'd be missing words, missing paragraphs, missing sentences, and he couldn't understand it, I couldn't understand it, because I thought I knew where my eyes were going, but it's one of those cases, what you don't know, you don't know. And so we could never figure out what was going on. Why was I not reading material properly? Why wasn't I comprehending it? If I heard it on the radio or heard other people talking, I picked it up immediately, and I could relate that information. When we did Bible verses at summer camps, pioneer camps and things, and I had the Bible verse and I heard it enough times, I could memorize it. But ask me to read some of these things directly, and I'd get a lot of things mixed up.
Now, a lot of these types of problems show up when kids start into school. Was this a problem that was evident even before you were in school, or did it only surface once you were in school?
I think it only surfaced when I was in school. I mean, I don't know when it actually happened because I've had this problem. I had this problem all my life. I mean, if you don't know any different and somebody tries to explain it to you and things don't show up, how do you know you have a problem? And it wasn't until I was 16 or 17 that it was actually diagnosed as having done. I mean, I'd gone to the Children's Hospital, I'd had tons of tests done, teachers would, would say to my parents, he's an intelligent kid, why doesn't he do better? I mean, he should be doing much better. And no one figured out it could be an eye problem simply because I'd done eye tests and my vision was perfectly fine.
So from grade 1 through what, grade 8 or 9?
Yeah.
You went undiagnosed with this problem, which
Yes.
we're going to get to talking about what the solution was. But I just want to get a little bit more of a picture as to what those years were like for you. You know, you've mentioned the teachers would say, you know, he's a smart kid, you know, he should be doing better. What were the kind of comments that would show up on your report card?
Doesn't apply himself, easily distracted. I don't think they said lazy directly, but I think they implied it, especially in parent-teacher interviews, that I wasn't applying myself, was lazy, didn't pay enough attention. Because, you know, I would talk to my teachers. I would be following news stories. I mean, when major world affairs happened, I knew all about it. In 1988, while we were on spring break in grade 6, there had been a hijacking somewhere in the Middle East, and my grade 6 teacher came in and started talking about people losing freedoms, and immediately I knew what he was talking about. Nobody in the class did, but I knew the information because I'd paid attention to it. I'd been listening to the radio all week, following it.
Right.
And so why is it that I knew this information, but you asked me about what we were talking about in school and the last night's homework, it didn't clue in. I took bits and pieces and tried to put it together, and it didn't make any comprehensive sense.
How did other kids treat you?
I was a loner. I've always been a loner. I mean, nobody really wanted to hang out with me. I was always that dumb kid because I couldn't perform well in school. I mean, outside of certain issues, I was great. You know, you asked me about current events, I knew what was going on. But you asked me about last night's homework or things like that, I was an outsider. I never kept up with what a lot of my peers were watching on television or the latest movies because I was always at home trying to study to catch up with what everyone else was doing.
So what were you doing during those times when you were trying to fix this thing on your own? What were you doing?
I was just constantly studying, trying to talk with my parents, bringing out my homework, and again, they couldn't understand why I couldn't comprehend what was actually going on. I mean, why couldn't I spell properly? Why couldn't I go over things? You know, if I was given a verbal test, if I was asked to spell out loud, no problem. I mean, I remember having my stepmother sitting down with me, going through a spelling quiz, going through, and one of the words that's always stuck with me was government, and learning how that was spelled. And visually, verbally, I could spell it no problem. Next morning in the spell test, when we're writing it down, I couldn't spell it at all. Yet, if my teacher came to me and said, "How do you spell government?" I could spell it perfectly. And nobody could really understand why things were getting mixed up. B's and, I mean, even this minor dyslexia was thrown in there. And they always diagnosed it, oh, it's dyslexia, or it's this, or it's that. No one really understood what the actual problem was.
It was frustrating for all of those other people that you were dealing with. What was it like for Jeremy as a young boy?
Very aggravating, very frustrating, constantly trying. I mean, you're building up, I don't want to say anger, but you're just constantly frustrated. You're going to bed crying at night because you don't understand what's going on. You're lonely, you're depressed. Nobody wants to deal with you. No one knows what's going on. It's like, people who have illnesses that nobody can ever seem to figure out the problem with. Do you want to get up in the next morning and even go to school? And I think, I enjoyed going to school, I think, because I don't know why I enjoyed going to school, but I seemed to enjoy going to school. But, what was I doing there? I mean, I was trying to learn, but was I really learning anything? And in a lot of cases I wasn't, because I was missing some of those key pieces. It's like building a house, If you don't put up a proper framework, things start to fall down. And that's something I'm still suffering with, is the fact that I didn't get some of that foundation, or it was taught to me, but I didn't actually get any of it. So picking up was very difficult.
The age that you're describing, particularly as you got a little bit older, are ages, an age when kids really define themselves in a sense, where self-esteem is an issue for virtually every kid,
Yep.
I would think. What was going on with your self-esteem during that time?
What self-esteem would probably be the best way I didn't have any. I mean, nobody wants to hang out with me. I have no friends. I was trying to figure out other things, learning other things to get popular, and trying to figure out how computers work, and knowing more about the news, and going back into that little world, my own little bubble in some aspects of trying to cope with daily life.
Well, when we come back after the break, we're going to find out a little bit about what you found out about yourself and how things changed. So just hang in there for a couple of minutes. We'll be back with Jeremy Hexham. Welcome back to Top Story. We're talking today about learning disabilities, and my guest is Jeremy Hexham. Jeremy, you painted a picture just before we went to break of what your life was like as a kid growing up with this disability. But what did you discover? What was really going on?
Well, in about 1989, I was reading The New Realities, Peter Drucker, with my dad. It was an exciting time. I was really following the news story. Communism was falling apart. The Berlin Wall had fallen. And I was reading this book, and I think this is when my dad really realized there was something wrong with my eyes. Because I'd be reading with him, and the only time he could understand what I was reading or make sense was when I had my finger under the words. Because if I didn't have it, I was missing words, I was missing sentences and paragraphs. And my dad was just getting frustrated. And after January, he had been talking with our former family doctor in High River, and his wife had actually been my speech therapist. And she'd said to him that there was a new test that was being done for this. She'd read about it, and it sounded exactly like the problems I was having. And so on Family Day in 1990, I went to see Dr. Linda Metzella at Foothills Educational Psychologists and spent a day, and she did a bunch of tests on me and discovered that, in fact, my eyes weren't quite in sync. Mm-hmm. The human eye is supposed to view things like a V. So when you look at paper, you read V-shaped. My eyes were a minor X. Mm-hmm. And so one eye was going slightly different in one direction, the other eye was slightly in another direction. And it would never show up on the eye tests, because you know you have big line, big words, everyone can see it.
Right.
But they never did a little test on it, and it was a test that had just been discovered, I think, a year or so earlier.
Oh, really? So it was a brand new thing. Without that new diagnosis, yeah. I mean, you would have just continued with the problem.
I would have continued, and nobody would have known what was going on.
So once they knew what was going on, what happened then?
Well, that's when things really started to change for me dramatically. I could start reading properly after. I shouldn't say I started reading right away. I had to do I did about 6 months to a year of eye tests. One of the things that my dad and stepmom would do every night for about half an hour to 45 minutes, we do eye exercises. So I'd have maybe a tip of a pencil, and both eyes would have to follow the pencil. I had a little piece of string with two balls on it, and I'd have to form a V, cross my eyes to form a V. And I had another exercise that had some bullseyes, and I had to take the two of them and make them one just by crossing my eyes and doing these eye exercises.
So in a sense, you were kind of flexing those muscles and getting them in shape.
Yes.
And then eventually, did it reach a point where you know you were set? You had a kind of new set of muscles and new set of almost memory going on there.
Within 6 months, the eye problem had basically been corrected. Now, every so often, if my eyes feel tired, I still do those tests again just to help strengthen them. So I still do it, not regularly, but I still do it on occasion. But yeah, within 6 months, major difference. The fact of the matter is my mother actually lived in Winnipeg, and that summer I'd gone out to see her, and I was reading, and she was amazed in that 6 months period from Christmas to the summer that my reading had dramatically improved. My parents noticed, my dad and stepmom were constantly noticing how much of an improvement there was. Teachers were noticing it. My grades, which have never been that great, were slightly better, and the teachers could see that I was understanding the material better and not relying on other things like the radio as much.
You mentioned that still with all of that, and I mean that happened when you were in about grade 9.
Yes, about 16.
That somehow there was still a foundation that was missing that you still struggle with to this day. Tell me about that.
Oh yeah, I still can't spell for the life of me. I mean, spell checks are the greatest things since sliced bread as far as I'm concerned. Computers, I still have problems writing. I'm very self-conscious about what I write. Even when I read, I'm still scared of reading, and in some ways I try to avoid it. I mean, I prefer cleaning my house to reading at times.
You must really hate reading.
I love cleaning.
Well, that's a rare gift.
I know. But you still have those problems, that I'm still struggling with it, because I did not get that foundation for writing. When kids were learning about verbs and putting sentences together, it was a huge jumble for me, and I'm still struggling with it to this day. And luckily there are things like computers that can help me, and sometimes I still actually go in depth into that technology and hide in that bubble.
So what impact did it have on you socially? I mean, you say that you started to hide in that bubble, as you refer to it, when you were a kid. Did the sudden change, the sudden improvement in your ability to read have a social impact on you as well?
Not a lot of one, because I'd never gained some of those social skills that you gain growing up, because when my peers were out doing whatever at night, going to movies, learning how to date, I was still at home struggling to get through schoolwork and still trying to catch up. I mean, even throughout high school, I'm still trying to catch up on that area, on that lower levels that I never really got. So, some people might be able to turn out an essay in no time. It still takes me quite a while putting together the essay and thinking the topic, and I might have great ideas, but putting it on paper isn't as easy as some other kids would have who didn't have this learning disability problem, because they've learned how to write and do research at a younger age, and it's just very natural, no problems.
Do you feel like it benefited you in any way to struggle with that? And it sounds like it really was a struggle.
It was a huge struggle. I think there are benefits to it, because you learn certain things at a younger age. I mean, I became addicted to talk radio, CBC, and learning things, and that has in fact sparked my interest in current events and politics, and I've had some great experiences. I mean, one of the experiences I had was actually being able to work with Stephen Harper when he was running for the leadership of the Canadian Alliance in 2002. And he said, Jeremy, you're a great worker, you've done some great things, go back to school and get your degree, because until you do that, you're not going to be of any use to us, yourself, or other groups. And I mean, I've just finished my degree about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So there has been that struggle, and I have learned things. But, with everything you learn, there are those struggles that you have to go through.
What's your degree in?
General Studies through Athabasca University.
I'm wondering about things like compassion, whether or not you learned compassion for others who struggle with similar things.
I think I learned compassion, and I have compassion, but it's more at a distance, I think, because I still get easily frustrated by things when they don't come together. And so I do understand where other people come from, and I think I may be taking it, I do have that compassion, but maybe more at a distance, because I step back in a lot of ways. I mean, I know what I've gone through, and I understand what other people go through, but I don't want to get too involved, because I know what it's like, and I don't want to go through it again.
Do you have anything you'd like to say to other kids? There might be a kid watching this interview.
Just do your best and do what you can. I mean, it's tough. I mean, I'm lucky. I had my parents supporting me. I have computer assistance of voice-activated software that my parents were able to get me. And if it's a kid suffering from a learning disability, talk to people, talk to your parents, talk to teachers. Most schools have learning resources officers who can help. I mean, there's not much that can be done until you're tested, and you're still on your own with a lot of things. But just to believe in yourself and to keep trying.
If you hadn't been able to pursue things privately, were there in any way enough resources to help you?
Unfortunately, there's not. Every university and school sort of, in my opinion, pays lip service to learning disabilities in the fact that they say, oh yeah, we'll help you, but there isn't a lot of help out there. When I go to school, with employment, I mean, I have had to provide my own voice-activated software for jobs, because employers don't think they should have to pay for it, or don't want to pay for it, as is the case in England, where they will pay for those resources. Schools, there's so many kids who have disabilities and issues that you're not always at the top of the list when you need resources. When you ask teachers to help out with giving verbal exams or something, they don't want to do it. And so it is a struggle from those aspects as well.
What's work life been like for you, and what are your prospects now?
And now that I've got a degree, I think they're getting better. But there have been challenges. People have said, why is it taking you 10 years to get a degree? They look at you almost as if they're not sure they want to hire you, because they're not sure if you're good enough because of taking you so long with things. And people don't understand learning disabilities. And it's not really so much a learning disability that I had, as I had an eye problem that caused other problems. And I mean, if it was another disability that I had I been blind or deaf or paraplegic, there would be a lot more resources out there for me. And that's where I think society has to understand that we need to be out there. I mean, the government loses, I believe, $1.7 billion a year in tax income from people who didn't complete high school. Now, are all of these people having learning disabilities? Not necessarily. But even if we're more productive, if employers and people took and had understood the learning issues and realized that we're not dumb, we're not stupid, we're highly intelligent people, and we can do a lot of great things.
Well, and I think that's quite obvious.
Yeah. We can do a lot more for society, and we can help bring out that extra income for the government and other people, and realizing that.
Clearly, your verbal skills did not take a beating, Jeremy.
No, they didn't.
Do you think that's one of the kind of ripple effects of what you struggled with?
Yes, it is, definitely. It's also one of my downfalls, because it's where I hid. I hid behind CBC Radio, listening to you and Jeff Collins and others throughout history, throughout my life. You know, the morning show, the eye-opener.
I've never heard anyone say before that they hid behind me. I'm almost flattered.
Oh, well, I mean, I hid behind talk radio because it's where I learned things. It's sort of where I got all my information from. And if it wasn't discussed on the morning show, the eye-opener, it's something I didn't really know about or as much.
Well, that could be risky.
Yeah, well, but it's a way for me, it's how I learned.
Yeah.
And
tell me about your tie. I like your tie. Is it about Rodin's The Thinker? Is that
Rodin's
who that
The
is?
Thinker, I thought it would be appropriate for today. Just, you know, people with learning disabilities, we are thinkers. We are intelligent people. And people shouldn't write us off just because we've got a little disability or a little slower or we need a little extra help. You know, timelines, you know, I can write great essays. I might not be able to write a perfect essay overnight, but give me a week and lots of time and ideas. I can write some beautiful essays and I can do some great things.
Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for coming in and talking with me today. And,
Thank you.
And I do wish you all the very best.
Thank you very much.
My guest on Top Story today, Jeremy Hexham. Stay tuned. On Top Story Forum, we'll meet Jeremy's dad. Well, welcome back to Top Story Forum. We're talking today about learning disabilities and the toll they can take on young people. Joining me on the panel today are Jeremy Hexham, Mark Mealey, who's Associate Professor of Theology at Rocky Mountain College, and Irving Hexham, who is Jeremy's dad. He's also a Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Calgary. Of course, I mentioned that I had met Jeremy 20 years ago, and that's because I knew you 20 years ago, Irving.
That's right, Sheila.
Now, we didn't talk in the interview about the fact that Jeremy, coming from an academic family, both you and his stepmother are academics. I would think that would really increase the burden on this kid.
I think that made things worse in many ways because it put a certain pressure on him. In terms of expectations, in terms of people looking at him and thinking, you know, he comes from an academic family, he should do better, why doesn't he do better? Yes, in many ways it did, and the thing about it was, as he explained so well, none of us knew what was happening. I mean, here was a kid who seemed to be quite bright. He could talk about things, he listened to the news, he knew what was happening in the world.
In fact, he could talk about things far better than most kids his age, let's face it.
That's right, but when it came to reading or when it came to writing, he couldn't do it. And he would say to me, you know, as you are with parents, you read books with kids and you get them to read, and he would read a sentence and he would miss out half a dozen words, or he would say some word that wasn't there, and you say, look closer, you know, you're not concentrating.
Pay attention.
Why didn't you pay attention?
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah.
And he would say, I didn't see it. You know, I didn't see it. And, you know, how on earth can't you see it? It's there on the page.
Well,
Come on.
I know what you're talking about because I have a son and I'm a good speller and he was not a good speller, and we had a similar kind of thing going on in our family until he was assessed by someone outside the school system who was very good for him in a number of ways. Among other things, let him know that he was in fact very bright indeed, and I think it made such a huge difference to his self-esteem to be affirmed in someone's eyes like that. It makes a huge difference to kids.
No, I think it makes a huge difference. Where I think we went wrong really was once he had the tests done and he started reading properly. As he said, it was I would say it was longer than 6 months. I thought it took about a year for him really to get the eyes in shape. Once he could read, one assumes that people read and you pick things up, and you don't realize there's this 10 years and more in which more than anything else he had lost confidence in reading. And so he could read something, but he wasn't certain he was still reading. And I think that lag took a long time to overcome, and to an extent he's still overcoming it, but I think he's more or less overcome it by now. You know, he doesn't have the same difficulty. But you know, one's got to say, when you read an academic textbook or something, sometimes there's some really stupid sentences in it. And Jeremy was doing his degree at Athabasca, and he would call me up and he said, "Here, I've just read this. What does it mean?"
And you'd say, "I have no clue."
I would say, "I have no clue. You know, that sounds dumb to me." Yeah, and I'm right in thinking it doesn't make much sense. And yes, you are.
And it doesn't help when you have a learning disability and you're trying to do all that, and you're reading stuff, and you know it should make sense, and you're confused, and you already have problems with self-confidence.
So, Jeremy, was it harder having the professor here as your father when you were going through all this?
Definitely, because I mean, Hexham isn't a very common name. You know, so you know, a lot of people in the circles would know the name Irving Hexham from CBC Radio. Oh, your your dad's a professor. Oh, you must be very smart. You must do well in school. I mean, people always assume that. People always assume I've continued well. I've done well in university, and I'm finished my university. I'm gone on. Or haven't you got your PhD done yet?
Aren't you Dr. Hexham too?
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of thing does happen.
And that could be a real burden.
Yes, it can be. And it was hard, you know, when you explain to people that no, you know, you're trying hard, but you're still having all these problems.
Mark Mealey, you're a professor at a college. Do you see kids who are struggling with this kind of thing from time to time?
Well, yes, of course. I'm never sure how many of them there are, but sometimes students will identify themselves to me and explain the difficulty that they're having, and I assume there are lots more who don't explain it to me and don't mention it to me and somehow struggle through. Even then, I'm never quite sure how much I can do to help, but there are things I'm sure that can be done, and there are things that I've tried in different circumstances from the ones Jeremy's described. But I have a son, too, who can't spell, and when I try to correct him while we're doing his work on the computer, he pushes me away and says, "No, it's okay. The spell checker will take care of it."
I know it used to be a huge frustration to me in parent-teacher interviews, when teachers would say, "Oh well, spell check exists, so you know your child will have nothing to worry about," and I would think, what a cop-out. I mean, that's a horrible kind of thing to fall back on, and yet you're telling me, Jeremy, that's a lifesaver for you.
Well, it is a lifesaver for me. Should it be used? No. Kids should still be able to spell properly, because there are situations. I have a Palm Pilot, and one of the things I love about my Palm Pilot is I have a spell check on there, so I can type in words, because when I'm writing handwritten notes, which I sometimes have to do, you want to spell the word correctly, and you still need those skills, and if you've never really learned them, you have to have something to fall back on. So the dictionaries do come in handy.
Spell checks don't catch everything, though,
no,
do
they don't.
Now, you guys are both academics, albeit at the college and university level. But as academics, I mean, do you feel as if the resources are there, Irving? I guess both as a parent and as an academic. Do you feel the resources are anywhere close to what they need to be within the regular school system?
Well, I think they are getting better. They're not as good as they are in Britain, but the big problem in Jeremy's case with the eye tracking, because it was a tracking problem with the eye muscles that caused this failure of vision, which I suppose is the best way of putting it. And the big problem with that was it wasn't recognized. No one knew, not the teachers. You couldn't blame the teachers or anyone. No one recognized it until this new test came out, which was actually a test that looked at the eyes in motion rather than static vision. And once that came out and one was able to identify the problem, things got better. But even then, in the university system and things, if Jeremy was in Britain, he could go to somewhere like Oxford and take all his exams orally. You can't do that in Canada, or if you can, it's extremely difficult to do. I've heard the University of Alberta apparently is quite good at that. I've not heard people at the University of Calgary saying that they can do oral exams. They may be able to, and I don't know about it, but it is pretty rare. And the thought of oral exams shocks people. But in actual fact, one of the things I discovered when I was teaching at the Humboldt University in Berlin is that normally German exams are oral. You don't have written exams except for special tests and things. And it's normal to test people orally, and I think that's an excellent idea.
Well, I mean, it's one thing to test them orally, but I mean, the kind of classical teaching tradition used to be that the professor really would have students gathered around him, and it would be very much a kind of oral tradition. So you would have thrived if you'd been born in a completely different century. If you'd been around in the time of Jesus, you would have been
exactly. And I mean, going back to something else my dad said, I actually went to one of my professors in one of my classes and said, you know, can I get an oral exam? And I'd already identified myself as learning disabled. She had no problem giving me double time to write my exams, use a computer. Can I do an oral exam? No, because that would give you an unfair advantage over other students.
Interesting. Mark, do you think within the academic community that something like oral examination should be available to people who have particular challenges?
Well, I certainly think that oral exams can be given in a way that's far more difficult than a written exam. You have fewer clues, maybe, and you're expected to be able to be articulate about a subject and understand a subject. I think they can be perfectly legitimate, of course. Of course, I think there are also limits to what schools can do to help to assist people who are dealing with learning difficulties. And some learning difficulties, of course, are far more critical or acute, rather. And there might not be strategies to help to bring someone to the place where they can finish degrees or and so on. And I think that we you know, there's a whole wide varieties of various kinds of learning disabilities and people who are dealing with them who would need a wide variety of strategies. I'm certainly not expert, and I don't know what those all would be, but I can only imagine that with the complexity that Jeremy faced in finding a solution and beginning to find ways to address it, other people face higher degrees of complexity and difficulty, and it must require a lot of imagination and more flexibility, I think, in education and in other parts of our world to help reach out to people, give them the things that the resources they need so that they can succeed and as Jeremy said, make a valuable contribution to the world.
Well, exactly. You know, tap into that considerable intelligence that's obviously there.
Now, one of the things I've got to say is when we were told about the tests that he could have, we in fact had to pay for them, and fortunately we were in a position we could afford to pay for them. And at that time they cost something like between $1,200 and $1,500.
No, it's not
just
cheap.
for one test.
Yeah, we found ourselves in the same position that if we wanted to get a diagnosis, if we didn't want to wait for the school system, then we had to step outside that system and, as you say, pay for it.
Yes, and then on top of that, there was the option of he could have gone to some private school in Calgary, and I forget the name now, it's a long time ago, but that was going to cost about $20,000 a year, and we couldn't afford that. So he still had to remain in the existing school system, even though the private school would have obviously been much better if one could have afforded it. So there are things there that I think the government could do for kids, and particularly, I mean, there's a lot, as Jeremy was saying, about the loss of income from the economy. There are a lot of kids from working class backgrounds and things who obviously suffer from this sort of thing and are never picked up.
I think before there's action, there has to be will, and I'm just wondering really if there's the will within the education system to deal with anyone who's just not quite the norm, you know, Jeremy?
Well, I'd say yes, there isn't that will. But I'll also say I can get into a lot of trouble going any further on that in my view. So, but yeah, I think there needs to be that will. The government and the school boards and others have to get involved, and they have to understand that they need to do more. And even employers and universities, everyone has to accept this in a lot more detail, as they do in England.
I mean, you've got to admit, some of the teachers you had were very good. Miss Rochelle's was extremely good.
I had some great teachers, but I also had some teachers that weren't that good. That sort of, I had one teacher who said, a learning disability? Nah, that's not a real disability at all. Just suck it up and get on with it. And I mean, back then in the early 90s, they could get away with saying that. Nowadays, they couldn't. If somebody did that, it would be an issue. We've been reading about it on the front page of the Calgary Herald.
I have no doubt that that government needs to fund these things better, think these things through better, apply better strategies. But I think there's something in what you said that makes me wonder whether an important part of the solution isn't making helping education to be closer to the circles of people who love you. In other words, if families have more input into what happens in education, if they have more ability to speak into the needs of their children, which they understand probably better than other people do, or more at arm's length, the more individual needs of children can be met if you're dealing with learning problems.
We're going to get around to talking a little bit more about communities of support. We have to take a short break right now. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Top Story Forum. Our topic today is learning disabilities. Jeremy, at some point you decided to go public with what you had struggled with. In fact, I first read about your story in Reader's Digest,
Yes.
which is not too shabby a publication to
it's
start
not.
out with.
December 2005 edition of Reader's Digest, and the story is still up there. If you go into Reader's Digest, .ca and type in my name, the story still comes up.
Yeah, that's where I first read it myself. So why the decision to go public with this?
Well, I'd actually written that as an essay for one of the courses I was doing at Athabasca, and I thought, well, you know, I think this is interesting. I think people would like it, and I sent it to somewhere at Reader's Digest just to get their feedback, to see what they thought about the whole thing. I mean, was it publishable? Would anybody really care about this? You write an essay for school, nobody cares about but you and maybe your instructor. And I got an email back from Peter Stockland, who's the editor, saying, yeah, we're going to use it, and he thought it was a great story, and so that's how it sort of went from getting published.
Well, that would be a little bit of a boost to the self-esteem right there.
Huge boost.
Did you have any qualms about whether or not you really wanted to go public with your story?
Not really. Because I think I've gone through the struggle. Most of the struggle happened 10 years ago. I mean, there are still after effects, but I think that the information needed to get out, that people have learning disabilities, that we're not stupid, and I think people just need to know about it.
You made an interesting comment in our interview that you hated situations where you had to read, that you still dislike certain situations where you have to read. And when we spoke at one point before the interview, you'd mentioned Bible studies.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
And I think this is where the church needs to play an important role with people with their learning disabilities, that we have to understand. Bible studies. I'd go to Bible studies. Bible's played a major development in people's education for hundreds of years. So you go there, you want to learn what's involved, you want to get involved in the community. You're all sitting around, and somebody says, okay, we're going to read this passage, and everyone's going to read 2 or 3 verses.
And you freeze.
Not only do you freeze, but you try and figure out, okay, there's 6 people here, where am I going to be? And so you try to quickly figure out, read down there, okay, there, and try to read it ahead of time.
Not exactly conducive to listening to the rest of it, right.
Trying to read it several times ahead of time, so when it comes to reading out loud, you actually know what you're saying, you're not tripping over too many words. Problem is, if somebody reads an extra verse, it messes you up totally, and you don't always know what's going on in the discussion because you haven't paid enough attention because you're trying to get the reading done ahead of time.
So once again, I mean, you were just kind of trying to stay ahead of the game in a situation where you really would have liked to have just been understood.
Invisible.
Well, and understood and invisible. Well, is the church, does the church, do you feel, Irving, really play a part, or should the church be playing a part in dealing with situations like learning disabilities?
Well, I think this is a very big issue for the church, actually, if you think about it, because in America, the American, I think it's the Department of Education, make a statement that something like 30 million people are functionally illiterate. Now, how do you reach those if you put all your emphasis upon reading the Bible? And reading the Bible is obviously important for Christians, but if you make it such a big issue that people, to be a member of a church, you virtually got to go along to a Bible study, particularly young people who go off to Bible camps and things like this. They've got to read the Bible at some point, and if you're at a camp, you've got to read it at night. Every night people are reading round, and if you look stupid at that point, you're not going to want to go back. And so I think, obviously, a lot of people are lost to the Christian community through an insensitivity on the part of counselors and ministers and Bible study leaders. By the very technique of which Jeremy says, usually instead of having a passage and saying we're going to study this passage next week, you get there and you're given the passage and everybody reads a verse and you don't know which verse you're going to read because you go round in a circle. And this is devastating for people with that.
Well, I know in a number of developing countries that they've made a lot of use of other technologies, other medias, things like the Jesus film, another organization called Faith Comes by Hearing. And you're telling me that hearing is exactly the methodology that you used throughout your early years as a means of learning.
And I'll also confess I had a cartoon Bible at one point, a picture Bible, which, was easy to understand too, because there was a lot of pictures, so you could follow along too. I'm not saying that's the greatest way of learning the Bible, but it was a way to get the basic of the stories.
Yeah, and obviously particularly memorable and meaningful for you. I guess it becomes a question as to how you manage to offer both things at once, Irving. I mean, in a camp situation or whatever, I mean, do you have the visual for some kids and you have the reading for others? I mean, how do you deal with
at the junior camps, when they taught kids to memorize verses, Jeremy always did very well and got a lot of kudos from, you know, winning the competition of how many verses you can memorize. And then as he got older and went to the camps where you got to read, it was a problem. And I think you could have Bible studies. You don't have to have everyone reading round. You can have the leader asking somebody if they'll read in advance, and then you can read it.
Or
and
give
then
the option of passing.
And give the option of passing, yeah. I mean, give, you know, things could be done if people were aware of it. But when people aren't aware of it, the expectation is everyone's going to do it.
I think there's another way to look at that problem, too, which is that we tend to think about the people who are offering education are an impersonal office of government, the Department of Education for such and such a region, whereas traditionally the church has understood education as being a part of its mission in the world. And this is still true in missions situations in other parts of the world, and historically it's been true in North America and Canada that churches have offered education. And I personally believe that when people are dealing with learning problems or learning disabilities, the most important context are the people who love them. And if a church is going to reach out to people to educate them, it has the motivation of love, or at least it ought to have the motivation of love behind their setting up a school.
Well, I was going to ask, are you talking about church-run schools, or are you talking about the church somehow or other being able to come alongside just kids who are coming to a particular congregation?
I think in both cases, I've heard of churches that have very high quality programming for people with disabilities. But I'm also speaking of the possibility even of setting up schools. I think that the more personal the context is for the education, the more likely it is that needs are going to be met and recognized in the first place.
So you would see, for instance, like a tutoring ministry as being very much within the mandate of the church, rather than just whatever, activity programs midweek.
Yes, I think so. I think that the churches have over-spiritualized their mission sometimes and thought that it's possible to save someone's soul without saving their body. But in fact, the people who go to churches are not angels without bodies. They're human beings, and we come with a whole wide variety of needs. And I believe that in Christ, all of those needs, we have been saved, we are being healed. They're all addressable by the church.
So you're really talking about the whole person, that the whole intention of the faith is to address the whole person,
yes.
And that this is just part and parcel of it. Jeremy, would that have been significant for you as a young man to have the church come alongside you in a very different way from what you experienced?
I think it would have been, yes. Because I think if you know, at Bible studies, I've gone to enough of them a couple times and dropped out because of that reading. And, you know, if somebody would have been there and say, okay, let's make sure you read everything, make sure you understand everything, let's do it, let's meet half an hour ahead of time to discuss this passage and go through it and make sure you're clued in, or even afterwards. That would have been a major difference. But, you know, afterwards everyone goes their own separate ways, and, you know, sometimes you might get to meet with them for a coffee afterwards. But, you know, it doesn't always happen that way.
Irving?
No, I think this could have made a difference. I think one's got to think in terms of when people talk about praying and things. I mean, I remember Jeremy as a child sort of saying, you know, his prayers didn't seem to get answered on certain things. And, you know, these were the sort of things, his schoolwork and things. And so this creates a huge problem from a Christian viewpoint, from a spiritual viewpoint.
Well, yeah, I mean, if your prayers are not answered on something like this, I mean, did it shake your faith in a sense to struggle with what you struggled with?
Of course it shakes your faith, because you're trying so hard to do things and you're not getting anywhere, and you go to these Bible studies and you're constantly feeling people are looking at you thinking you're stupid. Why do you want to go back to that church? I mean, when you hear about people who went to the church as youth and then they leave it, it's usually because something's happened self-consciously or self-esteemly that they didn't want. They don't come back and they just don't feel welcome or confident.
Well, here's an interesting question for you, Irving, from the University of Calgary, and you, Mark, from a defined Christian college, as to whether or not you see those organizations as really ministering to the whole person in our society.
I think, unfortunately, the modern university has gone in a rather bad direction. In the 19th century, there was really a big debate about how universities ought to be, and the classic book is Cardinal Newman's book, The Idea of the University. And in that, he makes the argument that universities should cater to the whole person. And the other idea of the university is just the pure research university that pours knowledge into people and they can come out doing certain things. And we have increasingly gone in the direction of being knowledge factories rather than being places that form the individual. Now, there's still the liberal arts tradition. Newman's ideas would be found in the American liberal arts colleges, where it's not simply that you're learning, but it's how you learn and what you learn and what sort of person you are at the end of the learning. What are you going to do with the education? Mark, do you think the Christian colleges are doing any better job?
I think that Christian colleges have very much been shaped by the culture that's around them, and they too have tended to more and more in a pragmatic direction, where they say we are making people so that they can do certain jobs. I think that certainly must be part of their function, but I agree that it becomes more of a technical orientation rather than a whole person orientation.
Well, I want to thank you all for a very interesting conversation today. And Jeremy, I do hope you the very best with your future. I've just been so impressed listening to your story today.
Great.
My guests on Top Story Forum, Jeremy Hexham, Mark Mealey, who's an associate professor of theology at Rocky Mountain College, and Irving Hexham, who is Jeremy's dad, and he's also a professor at the University of Calgary. We'll be right back after this. Well, that's it for Top Story today. We'd like to hear from you if you've got a story idea. Give us a call at 263-3191. And if there's an event going on in your faith community that you'd like others to know about, you can use that same number. Once again, 263-3191. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sheila Rowe. Bye for now.